So let's talk about mystical experience and how it transforms you. First thing is let's start with neuroscience. So we know that when you engage in certain states of meditation, and our neuroscience in this, by the way, is in its infancy. And there's another reason for that, which is that when we do studies on meditation, we don't take a yogi from the Himalayas and study what happens to him. We usually take like 30 people and we'll put them through a mindfulness course over the course of 12 weeks and observe some changes. So it's kind of like, if you have an artist who's been practicing for 30 years, if we're studying art scientifically, we're going to take a bunch of 18-year-olds, give them a paintbrush, teach them how to paint, and then we're going to try to see what they make. So a huge problem with our studies on meditation is that they're done on novice meditators, not expert meditators. But that being aside, I can clip that if you want. So here's what happens. When you attain a certain state of consciousness, and by a state of consciousness, we can describe this as well. It starts with a one-pointedness of the mind, right? So if you look at our general experience, our mind has lots of thoughts, lots of emotions. We're like a light bulb instead of a laser beam. The energy is the same, but it is diffuse. I'm thinking about this. I'm worried about this. There's a lack of one-pointedness. So the first step on the road of consciousness is diffuse mental activity, or even absence of mental activity during sleep and things like that. Next step is what I would call the flow state. So flow state is when the mind is functioning, but it is one-pointed and has a particular goal. Flow state feels good, our productivity improves. There is equal activation of our emotional centers and logical centers of the brain. We're very goal-directed. We're not really using willpower because we're like in flow. So there's no effort, or there's some effort, but it's not like trying to rein in my diffuse mind, okay? That's next step. Still mental function, you still have somewhat awareness of who you are, but you lose some sense of time, right, in flow state. Then we go to the state of, and I would call flow state something like dharana. So dharana is focusing on one object. So putting your mind on like one thing and like focusing on that. And then we move into dhyan. So dhyan is when there is a dissolution of self. So my subjective experience kind of moves outside of my body and becomes melded with the object that I am focusing on. So we sort of see this dissolution of self. If you've entered like a state of meditation, you can say like some days like, oh yeah, I've been meditating this week. It hasn't been working. Like, what does that mean? And then sometimes you meditate and you're like, oh my God, like this feels great. What does it feel like? It feels like kind of like nothing, but in a good way, right? So that's the state of dhyan. So that's the second level. Now, neuroscience changes start to happen along this course. So you start to see autonomic changes. So our cortisol levels go down, sympathetic nervous system kind of deactivates some usually for most people, but depending on Kundalini practices and stuff, you can activate the sympathetic nervous system, which is part of the goal. So you basically get an evening out of your physiology. You also start to see, so in the flow state, you see balancing of logical mind and emotional mind. They're both active. Then you start to see destruction of the default mode network. So this is the part of our brain that gives us a sense of identity. So you start to like dissolve, like you experience without being me. Like I'm just here, but I'm not me. I'm just like something else. So this we know really, really well, actually, scientifically. So if you look at meditators, their default mode network will deactivate. Here's the really cool thing. So psychedelics are an awesome way to study some states of meditation because they're the first time that Western science can induce a certain kind of meditative state in a normal person. So you can separate out the long-term effects, like as you become slowly more enlightened, like who knows what's going on in your brain. So what we know is that if you give someone a psychedelic and you're looking for clinical improvement, just seeing things, colors, whatever, even having visions does not correlate with clinical improvement. If you want to heal trauma, if you want to recover from like treatment refractory depression, there's one experience that correlates with literally psychiatric healing, which is ego death. So the more ego death someone experiences during psychedelic treatments or practices, the more likely they are to heal. And that same thing happens in meditation as well. You experience some degree of ego death. That's deactivation of the default mode network. And then the last kind of area that we can sort of touch on a little bit is endogenous DMT production. Now, this is where we get into super like extrapolated science. Like this is something I've been working on for a while, but we know that the brain produces DMT, which is the active ingredient in
ayahuasca, chacuna leaf.
Is it ayahuasca?
Yeah, there's one, the leaf aspect. It has that.
So it's so we know that it gets produced. And the really interesting thing is if you look at the neurochemistry of DMT production. We don't know where it comes from. People will say it comes from the pineal gland. We don't know that. But one thing we do know is it's produced from serotonin. So you require a really high level of serotonin to drive that metabolic process forward. And this is also why, like, as people become more and more technologically dependent, our serotonin balance gets messed up, technology and things like that, which is why no one's getting like enlightened through meditation apps. Their dopaminergic, serotonergic balance is a little bit off. So if you look at all these like yogis and stuff, the reason you need a very specific diet that's like very serotonergic, there's a serotonergic diet, there's certain practices that fix your gut health. So serotonin comes from the gut predominantly, is developed from tryptophan. And so you need a certain kind of like tryptophan metabolism. You need a certain kind of serotonin metabolism. You can't be depressed, right? So you can't be anxious or things like that. Those imply a serotonin imbalance. And so once you kind of like become a yogi and you're like free of depression and anxiety and all that stuff, then you've got ample serotonin in your brain that turns into DMT. Then you get to really explore the weird conscious realm. Mm-hmm. So that's even beyond default mode network activation. So once you get there, then you have subjective experiences of consciousness. I mean, subjective experiences of like weird stuff in dimensions and like astral travel and all that shit. That's like super weird.
So I want to return back to the base. We'll build our way up.
Yeah.
You mentioned how, and I've, very much so felt this throughout my own practices, how there's something inherently pleasurable about the concentrated mind.
Okay.
And when you spoke to one-pointed focus and single-pointed focus.
First of all, let me ask you, when you say one-pointed mind is pleasurable.
Yes.
What's up with that?
Being concentrated on something is much more inherently pleasant in my own internal experience.
Why?
Because I suppose it's not distracted, which usually is unpleasant. There's a subtle feeling, I suppose, of anxiety inherent in a distracted mind.
Okay, cool. So let's like tunnel down into that a little bit. When you are anxious, what is going on in your mind?
It's scattered, so it's jumping from place to place.
Okay. Let me know if this is inappropriate. Have you had an orgasm before?
Once or twice.
Okay. So when you have an orgasm, what is going on in your mind?
Nothing.
Okay. Right? So you're presumably focused or even in this transcendent state. So if we sort of think about it like orgasm, and I know this sounds vulgar, but literally if you look at the meditative texts, they describe orgasm as one of the 4 ways to spontaneously achieve samadhi, which is like a temporary state of enlightenment, right? And why do we all feel so good? Hopefully, presumably, right? So if we look at it, orgasm is like a really quick way to get a completely one-pointed mind. And if exactly what you said, the more anxious you are, so what I've observed as a psychiatrist is that the speed, flow, and direction of your thoughts is like all of those are amplified when we're anxious, when we're depressed. Even in terms of psychosis, someone's mind is not calm. So a calm mind usually means a one-pointed mind. So orgasm is usually the thing that people connect to the most easily. But then also in like a flow state, it's less one-pointed in a flow state because your mind still is doing it's doing one thing at a time, but it moves from one thing to another to another. So what we sort of notice is that one-pointedness of attention feels good, and complete one-pointedness of attention feels blissful. Okay, so that's why people love orgasm. Flow state feels really good, but there's a gap there. So there are ways to achieve the one-pointedness of orgasm in your daily life, and that's when you have 45-minute orgasms, but you're not having sex. You just have these profound positive experiences, which I think in the Eastern tradition we call samadhi. But I think if you look at those states, like literally there is a mechanism in your body for you to produce the subjective bliss of orgasm. Whatever that mechanism is somehow gets activated by certain spiritual practices and certain spiritual trainings. This is why we call enlightenment bliss. So it's weird because we call it anand, which means bliss. We also call it enlightenment, which means knowledge, right? We also call it things like freedom, moksha, liberation. But like liberation, knowledge, and bliss are not like in the same ballpark, but there's one state that is all the essence of all 3 of those things. Now let's talk about technology. Okay, so that's the background. So what does technology do? The first thing that it does is it diffuses our attention. So we love technology because it concentrates our attention for a little while, right? So when I'm like watching a fantastic TikTok about like a cat meowing in a really cute way, my mind becomes completely one-pointed on that. So over time, what we're actually doing is the mind becomes weakened because the one-pointedness is triggered by a sensory experience. Okay? So I'd say that like forcing your mind to focus is hard. Getting it to focus automatically is really easy. But the more that I take the elevator, the weaker my legs get. So what's happening is the more we use technology, the more our mind becomes weakened in terms of focusing. And that's literally what we see. So if we look at increases in anxiety, increases in depression, increases in loneliness, literally we have a society of people that cannot control their attention. What they hate more than anything else is boredom, and everything is boring except for TikTok. And the moment that you lose control of your attention, then if you have anxious thoughts, you cannot rein them in. The moment you have depressive thoughts, so then what happens is like, I can't control my attention. So if I start to think anxious thoughts, start to think depressive thoughts, I go down a rabbit hole of that kind of stuff. The only way I can get out of it is to watch another TikTok. So now this feels bad to be anxious. I want to run away from my anxiety. I'm going to turn to my phone. Then once again, the phone pulls my attention away from all of the negativity. So now what's happening is it's almost like a mental cycle of becoming addicted to opiates, where my body hurts, I have to take a pill to make it go away. But the more opiates that I take, the more it alters my mu receptors, and the more sensitive to pain I become, the more dependent I become. So what we're sort of seeing is like addiction to technology, because there's a weakening of our attentional capability. And then if we're not using the technology, we're suffering. And the only antidote we have is this. So we turn to this again, and then we get weaker and weaker and weaker. And we're really hitting like a critical state here, which is why we have like, mental health epidemiology. There's like global pandemics of loneliness, suicidality, anxiety, depression. All these things are getting really bad. And I think it's due to this fundamental attentional loss.
In respects to the remedy for this and how we can cultivate practices that directly support us to have a more concentrated mind throughout our life, is Trataka, or what practices would really support people to be able to instill as a daily habit throughout their life that can, have them?
So basically, I'm going to answer in two ways. One is it doesn't matter. So any practice that trains your focus is going to help. So dharana is like a focusing practice. So meditating on something. And what that let's get to fundamentals, okay? So dharana is when you tell your mind to do something. It's like training a dog. You tell it, I'm going to look at this. And the mind is like, I don't want to look at that. And then you pull it back like a leash. You pull it back, you pull it back, you pull it back. That's the fundamental thing that needs to be trained. And this is what we know from like studies, like fMRI studies and EEG studies on various types of meditation, that's the common element is like restraining our mind. So that's one thing. So the reason I like Trataka for a couple of reasons. One is that Trataka is interesting enough from a sensory practice and is not just focusing on your breath. So it's a different like anchor. So a lot of our like energy is in our eyes. We're very like visually focused right now. If you look at cell phone usage, like, sure, people listen to audiobooks, but we're using our eyes a lot. We're like a very eye-heavy society. So I think that's a good alambana or like pillar to use. So I like using the eyes. It feels cool to do. It also feels challenging in a way that evokes some good like ego activation, because I want to be able to stare at a candle flame without closing my eyes. That feels badass. Yeah. It's very easy to get like a sense of accomplishment when you like do it for a long time. The other thing that's really good about Trataka is it gives people a very quick example of a sensory experience that technology cannot give them. So we think that there are 7 colors that the human eye can visualize. If you do Trataka, you will easily realize there are more than 7 colors that we can see, which sounds like a wild statement. But when you do Antar Trataka, which is you stare at a candle flame for somewhere between 1 and 5 minutes without blinking, then you close your eyes and you'll see colors in your mind that are not quite the same colors that we can see in the visual spectrum.
It's like a negative inversion of it.
Yep, exactly. Right. So it looks like a negative. So it's this weird purplish, greenish, bluish. It's absolutely a color, but it's not like a regular color that you can see. So those are 3 of the reasons that I like it. So it's something that feels different from breath meditation, which people get bored of. It's not really mindfulness. It's like kind of like feels badass. It's challenging to do. And it feels difficult to do in a non-boring way. Like you really have to strain yourself. And then the 5th reason that I've never explained to anyone is that Trataka is also a Shuddhi practice for the Ajna chakra. So that means it's a cleansing practice for your third eye, which means that if you do Trataka, we don't tell people this, but if you do Trataka, their connection to the intuition and the Brahman and their own understanding of their problems will decrease. Increase. So they will like start to realize they're doing wrong things in their life. So it'll push them in the direction of spiritual growth, whether they like it or not. So I think the first thing to understand is that our attention is being farmed. Okay, so like literally, we have become attention farms. So if you look at like ad revenue from a platform, how does any like social media, TikTok, YouTube, whatever, how do they make money? They make money by having your attention. So they generate advertising revenue. The other thing that people in advertising have understood for a long time is if I can control your sensory organs, I can control your wants. So what we're starting to see is that you as a human being have one resource, which is probably the most valuable thing you have in your whole life, which is your attention. If you can focus your attention on a book and a study guide, you will get an A. If you can focus your attention on work, you will make money. If you get distracted, your attention is literally like the most valuable thing. And if other people can get your attention, if they can get your eyes, if they can get your attention, they can get you to buy things, they can make money. So literally like the most valuable thing you've got is your attention.
So the reclamation of our attention is essentially the reclamation of our life.
Absolutely. Right. And that's like in a very literal sense. I don't mean that metaphorically. Yeah. It's like, and right now what we're seeing is that people have claimed your attention. And once they have your attention, algorithms start this process of like what's called online radicalization. Happens to everyone. It's called online drift, actually. So over time, like your thoughts will be shaped by these algorithms, and then you'll vote a particular way. You'll get angry with a particular group of people. And so the key thing that's going on there is like, first of all, they're shaping your attention 100%. You're losing control of your life, right? Because you don't want to spend 6 hours on TikTok. But like you end up doing it anyway, and you're not even sure how or why. So what's happening is as people take control of your attention, they're taking control of your life, they're inducing certain kinds of behaviors, they're making money, your life is objectively getting worse. And I mean objectively as in correlates with increases in mood disorders and anxiety, things like that, loneliness, suicidality. So it's like terrible.